Joining us for more on that is Marina Kurtanova, our correspondent in the Russian capital, Moscow, and we also have Gilbert Doctorow, independent international affairs analyst from Brussels. Marina, if I could start with you, what's the latest that you're hearing in Moscow?
Well, the situation is calm now, but as you know, early in the morning, Vladimir Putin appealed to the nation, and he said that Russia is waging a hard fight for its future. The entire military and information machine of the West is directed against Russia. Any strife must be discarded during the period of the special operation, and now the fate of Russian people is being decided. Putin called the heroes of the Wagner fighters who fight in the northern military district, and their name and glory were betrayed by those who organized the rebellion. The armed rebellion organized by the head of Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is the result of exorbitant ambitions, Putin mentioned, that led to treason and betrayal. This is how Russian President Vladimir Putin described the situation in a televised address to citizens of the Russian Federation and military personnel, as well as to those who were dragged into a criminal adventure by deceit or threats, pushed onto the path of a serious crime, an armed rebellion. The president urged the rebels not to make a fatal and tragic, unique mistake, to make the only right choice, to stop participating in criminal acts. Putin said that the authorities will react harshly to what is happening. So these are the key theses of the heads of states address. Heroism at the front. So he mentioned that Russian troops are now fighting heroically against neo-Nazis and their masters, against the Russian Federation, virtually the entire military economic information machine of the West. The country is fighting for the life and security of Russian people, for Russian sovereignty and independence, for the right to be and remain Russia, a state with a 1,000-year history. The fate of the Russian people decides, and therefore everything what weakens must be thrown aside, including strife that will be used by enemies. Happening like a betrayer, a split in unity is essentially apostasy from one's own people, from comrades in arms who are now fighting at the front.
Right.
The Putin called this a step in the back, and the same blow was dealt in 1917. He compared this time when the
Okay.
victory in the First World War was stolen from Russia and the country itself, like its army, was destroyed. So he mentioned that Russia won't let this happen again. He mentioned about exorbitant ambitions and personal interests that led to treason, both to the country and to its people, and to the cause for which, side by side with Russian other units and fighters and commanders of the Wagner Group, fought and died. So the reaction will be harsh, he mentioned, and all the speech, but I must say there's another side of the story over the speech of the president of Russia. Unfortunately, there is a profound error in assessing what is happening. The absence of positive results of the special military operation is a consequence of the actual anarchy and detachment of the current political leadership of the country from existing problems in society, as well as a huge number of traitors in the highest bodies of state power and among the oligarchy. The Kremlin itself provoked everything what is happening today, and it was necessary to speak earlier. Therefore, the vast majority of Russian citizens support Yevgeny Prigozhin. Moreover, the information is coming that lots of the personnel of power structures, the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the Russian Guard, the FSB, the
Right.
FSO, the
On
Ministry
that
of
point, Marina, let me bring in Gilbert. Gilbert, so Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, has vowed to topple the Russian military leaders. Now, is that going to be an easy task? Because the US-led NATO military alliance has spent $100 billion in weapons trying to conduct that mission and has so far been unsuccessful.
Well, my fellow panelist in Moscow has made some very extravagant remarks about the sympathies of the Russian people in favor of Mr. Prigozhin. I don't believe this corresponds to reality, not from the sources of information that I've had, informal sources. But the point is that Mr. Prigozhin is counting on winning over the rank and file soldiers in the Russian armed forces. And that is the risk that Mr. Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin have sought to combat, to counter by ordering the military to take decisive action in Moscow and the Moscow Oblast. Not because any of Mr. Prigozhin's troops are advancing on Moscow, no, nothing of the sort, but because they fear that that rank and file soldiers could be misled by the propaganda barrage that has come from Mr. Prigozhin and also from my fellow panelists in Moscow. The reality of the situation on the ground is unknown to all of us. There has been a kind of news blackout in Russia, and we have selective information. You can only, by triangulating, you can understand that there's a serious problem in Rostov-on-Don, where the Prigozhin forces have taken control of military headquarters and presumably have surrounded some civilian administrative buildings as well. This is not an insignificant incident. The Rostov-on-Don is a major city. It is a major point of rallying forces and of assembling forces and equipment for the fight in Ukraine. So this is a significant issue that the Russian government must resolve in the coming hours, and we'll see how well they do. What I do want to point out is that the incident that we're now witnessing, the treason by Mr. Prigozhin, has been precipitated, has been encouraged by the policy of restraint of the Russian president. And that is an issue that has bearing on the global situation of the war in Ukraine and relations with the West. Mr. Putin is a very restrained government leader. He does not want to precipitate things. He does not want to move in an ill-considered and intemperate way. That is his personality, and his whole government time in office has been that way. The problem is that this very restraint has been confused by the White House, by the West in general, as a sign of weakness, and they have crossed time and again Russia's red lines. This is precisely what is going on with Mr. Prigozhin. He should have been arrested a month ago. When he first entered into open conflict with Russia's Minister of Defense, Mr. Shoigu, when he denounced the top generals in Moscow, the man should have been arrested. He wasn't. And that has made possible his continuing treason and the outbreak of insurrection that we saw yesterday.
You know, Gilbert, as you said, as you alluded to there in your final point, Prigozhin has been in a feud with the Russian military hierarchy for quite a while now. And is there a possibility, perhaps, that he's on the payroll of a third party?
This is an important issue that you're raising. Of course, there have been accusations along the way that he has been in too close contact with the Ukrainian intelligence forces. And there's also discussion that some of his information war going on with Moscow right now is facilitated by trolls and bots that are produced in the Ukraine. That's entirely possible. We don't know the extent of his contacts, but that there was any rumor whatsoever of his having been in touch with Ukrainian intelligence, this goes back several months, should have been a red flag. It should have led to his arrest back then. In the midst of a war for Russia's survival, it is wholly intolerable to have seen the kind of insubordination that Mr. Prigozhin has gotten away with for 1, 2, 3 months. That is unacceptable.
Yeah. Gilbert, why do you think that the Russian military kept hold of Prigozhin and his Wagner mercenary group? You know, was it because of the effectiveness of, I say effectiveness, because of his battle in Bakhmut, which he didn't exactly, succeed in liberating. It was the bloodiest and longest battle in Ukraine. Why do you think the Russians kept hold of him, retained his services for so long?
First of all, Prigozhin's forces worked. They stopped the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, Tromatsk, and the Russian version of it, and they were successful in expelling and killing the Ukrainian defenders of Bakhmut. That is undeniable. But let's put this in a bigger context. First of all, what was the whole battle about? It's customary to speak in the West about Bakhmut having been necessary to buy time for the Ukrainians to allow them to prepare for their military counteroffensive. I would say the same thing pertains to the Russians, but nobody's talking about it. That conflict, that central conflict in Bakhmut, gave the Russians several months to prepare this wonderful defense, multi-level, multi-layer defense that they have used so successfully to destroy the Ukrainian counteroffensive. All of the anti-tank traps, all of the minefields, all of the trench lines that go back 40 kilometers in a series. All of that took time to achieve, and that time was bought by the Bakhmut fighting. Now, Mr. Prigozhin's success there went to his head, and it also distorts our understanding of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Russian military and the private military of Prigozhin. His private military was charged with and undertook the extremely costly street battles in Bakhmut that ultimately led to victory and its cleansing of Ukrainian forces. But that was extremely costly on the Russian side. There were no Russian army forces there. They were these liberated criminals whose lives were, let's face it, expendable, and whose loss of life had no political cost to the Kremlin. That was all to the good. At the same time, Mr. Prigozhin's forces in no way are comparable to the power of the Russian armed forces that we see today in their repelling the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They don't have the air cover, they don't have the helicopters, they don't have the artillery and strength and the 20,000 rounds of artillery that are used every day by the Russian armed forces versus 5,000 of the Ukrainian forces. This is an unstoppable force that is not created by or run by Mr. Prigozhin. It is run by exactly the people he has been denouncing publicly for ineffectiveness and incompetence. It's all dead wrong. He has exceeded his position. He has overestimated his importance. And I believe he will find himself in Moscow, if he isn't slaughtered on the way, in a cage, just like the last big rebellion in Russia in the 1770s. The Pugachev was taken back to Catherine the Great in a cage. I think that is the fate of Mr. Prigozhin. And incidentally, this rebellion that was mentioned by Putin was in 1917, in September 1917. It was the rebellion of General Kornilov, who was treasonous with respect to his bosses, who were the provisional government, and was in cahoots with the British intelligence to revive the Russian war effort. That was unsuccessful. It led to the communist Bolshevik takeover a month later, and ultimately to the civil war. That's the sequence of events that Mr. Putin very briefly just mentioned in his speech this morning.
Right. So, just Gilbert, finally, in essence, the danger that you alluded to is that Prigozhin could, or Russian forces could, in essence, be mistakenly led or side with Prigozhin. Is that the danger that Russia faces at this moment in time?
Sorry, can I add something?
Well, let me just finish with this response to that question. There is a small risk, but very small. If Mr. Putin were Mr. Yanukovych, I would say it's a big risk. If Mr. Putin were not Mr. Putin, and if he had around him people who are not so decisive and so competent, then there would be a risk. But given Mr. Putin being who he is, and his ability and willingness to crush in a cruel manner, as he said in his speech this morning, all of the insurgents, I believe that this will be mopped up very quickly.
Okay. And Marina, very quickly, if you can,
Yes.
we just have a minute
Yes.
left.
Can I add something? First of all, we should not underestimate achievements of Wagner PMC. It's actually a very powerful fight, which are very pro-patriotic, pro-Russian, I must add. And the conflict between Prigozhin and Defense Minister Shoigu has been going on more than 6 months. At the very last, it was necessary to put him and the Minister of Defense at the negotiating table and to begin to solve existing problems, and not to bring it to such a situation, because there are a lot of problems. And the day before, Evgeny Prigozhin recorded a 13-minute video about real things happening at the front, as well as the huge losses in the Russian troops hushed up by the official authorities. So let's speak frankly. So that's the point.
Okay. Gilbert, 30 seconds. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, there's been discussion for months now about the relative loss rate on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. And I have said before, and I'll say again, you have to look at the correlation of forces in artillery, which this has been primarily an artillery war for the last half a year or more. And the Russians have a 10-to-1 ratio of artillery pieces and a 5-to-1 ratio of artillery shells to the Ukrainians, and that pretty much is reflected in the relative loss rate of both sides. So the Ukrainians can throw around any numbers they want, but the reality that we outside observers can bring to bear is the force ratio, which favors the Russians.
Okay, let me thank our guests for this extended coverage. Gilbert Doctorow is an independent international affairs analyst joining us from Brussels. And we also had Marina Kurtanova, our correspondent from the Russian capital, Moscow.